The morning they burned Daniel Whitmore's house down, he was sitting on his porch drinking coffee and watching them do it. He didn't run, didn't scream, didn't beg. He just sat in his wooden rocking chair, the one his late wife Alina had painted blue 32 years ago, and watched the orange fingers of flame curl around the window frames of the home he had built with his own hands in 1971. He watched the roof cave like a sigh. He watched 53 years of marriage dissolve into smoke. He watched the photographs of his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, every Christmas, every birthday, every Tuesday afternoon that had ever mattered blacken and curl and become nothing. He was 81 years old. And he did not cry. Not because he wasn't broken, he was. Something deep in his chest had cracked open the moment the first window shattered from the heat, a sound he would hear every night for the rest of his life when the dark got too quiet. But Daniel Whitmore had learned something in 81 years that most people never figure out, something he had first understood in a Vietnamese jungle in 1968 when a boy from Georgia named Tommy Reeves had saved his life and then died 30 seconds later. Tears are for after the war. During the war, you count your ammunition. So he counted. He had the clothes on his back, his wallet, which held $47 in cash, a VA card, and a photograph of Alina on their wedding day. The only photograph that had survived because it lived in his breast pocket, always every single day, because he had promised her ghost that he would keep her close. He had his truck, a 2003 Ford F-150 with 214,000 miles on it, and a cracked dashboard that Alina used to rest her feet on during long road trips. He had his mind, which was sharper than most men half his age, and his body, which ached in the mornings but still worked, still carried him, still got up every single day without being asked twice. That was inventory. Now came the question of who. The fire marshal arrived at 9:47. His name was Gerald Pitts, and Daniel had known him since Gerald was 12 years old and used to steal peaches from the tree in Daniel's backyard. Gerald was 53 now, gray at the temples, soft around the middle, and deeply uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the heat still radiating off the rubble. "Daniel," he said, standing at the edge of what had been the front yard, holding his clipboard against his chest like a shield. "I'm so sorry." "Tell me something useful, Gerald." Gerald cleared his throat, looked at his clipboard, looked back at Daniel. We're calling it electrical, old wiring, could have happened any time, place this old." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. "That right?" "That's right. And the spray paint on my front walk." Gerald's jaw tight. The words had mostly burned away, but Daniel had seen them before the fire department arrived. 3 words in red paint, the kind of message a coward leaves in the dark. Sell or burn. He had taken a photograph with his phone. He always took photographs now. His grandson Marcus had taught him that 2 years ago. Document everything, pop pop. The whole world's a courtroom if you know how to use it. We're looking into that separately. Daniel stood up from his rocking chair, which he had dragged to the edge of the road before the fire department arrived. He tucked the chair under his arm. It wasn't heavy. Alina had built light and walked to his truck. "You let me know what you find, Gerald." He drove away before the television cameras arrived. He already knew what the story would say if he stayed. Elderly man loses home in tragic accident. He had no interest in being a tragedy. He was gathering intelligence. The land had been in Daniel's family since 1946. His father, Roosevelt Whitmore, had bought it for $800 cash in a transaction that took place in a lawyer's office in Macon, Georgia. 4 acres of river bottom land in what was then the unfashionable eastern edge of Callaway County. Roosevelt had cleared it himself, planted it, built a small house, and when Daniel came home from Vietnam in 1969 with a Purple Heart and 3 broken fingers that never set quite right, Roosevelt had handed him the deed and said, "This is your fight now, son, keep it." Daniel had kept it. He had expanded the original house over the decades, room by room as the family grew and the money allowed. He had buried Alina in the back corner under the magnolia tree she had planted as a sapling in 1975. He had raised 3 children on that land, had watched 12 grandchildren learn to walk on it, had eaten 30 years of tomatoes from soil he had turned with his own hands. Then the developers came. They came politely at first, a young man in a good suit named Preston Hargrove, representing something called Callaway Capital Partners. The county was growing, property values were climbing. Daniel's 4 acres sat in the exact center of a proposed development, 40 luxury townhomes, a boutique hotel, a curated retail experience. Preston used the words generational wealth and life-changing offer and the responsible choice. Daniel had offered him a glass of iced tea and then asked him to leave. They came less politely after that. Noise complaints filed with the county. Daniel's property was suddenly in violation of ordinances that hadn't been enforced in 30 years. His well water was flagged by an inspector who arrived unannounced and left without giving his name. His property tax assessment doubled in 11 months, then tripled. Then a letter arrived from a law firm in Atlanta suggesting that a portion of the original 1946 deed may have contained a title defect that could cloud ownership. Daniel had called his grandson Marcus. Marcus Whitmore was 34 years old, a corporate attorney at a firm in Atlanta where he was the only black man who had ever made partner before his 40th birthday. He drove up to Callaway County on a Saturday in October, sat at Daniel's kitchen table for 6 hours, and read every document Daniel had kept in the fireproof safe, 54 years of receipts, deeds, tax records, correspondence, everything. When he was done, he looked up at his grandfather and said quietly, "Pop, these people have made some very serious mistakes." "They made the mistake of thinking I was alone," Daniel said. That had been 3 months before the fire. The morning after his house burned, Daniel slept in the cab of his truck in the parking lot of the Calvary Baptist Church, where he had been a deacon for 31 years. At 6 a.m., Pastor Dolores Simmons knocked on his window holding a thermos of coffee and a plate covered in foil, and Daniel climbed out and ate scrambled eggs on the church steps while the sun came up gold and enormous over the Georgia pines. "You're welcome in my house," Dolores said. She was 68. Built like a woman who had weathered things, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her forehead and a directness Daniel had always appreciated. "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine, I said you're welcome." He looked at her over his coffee. "You know what they're saying in town." "I know what fools say. I'm not asking you what fools think. I'm telling you where you can sleep." She paused. "Eleanor would haunt me if I let you live in that truck." He almost smiled. "Almost. 1 week I have things to do." "You have as long as you need." She stood up, smoothed her dress. "Marcus is on his way. He called me last night." "He called you?" "He's a smart boy. He knew you wouldn't call." She picked up the empty plate. "He said to tell you the documents are safe." Daniel exhaled for the first time in what felt like 20 hours. The fireproof safe had been recovered from the rubble by a deputy named Calvin Hughes, who had served under Daniel in the county's Volunteer Emergency Management Corps for 8 years and who had carried the safe to Daniel's truck himself quietly, without being asked. The documents were safe, the chain of title was intact, the correspondence was intact. And Marcus had spent 3 months building something else. What the people at Callaway Capital Partners didn't know, what Preston Hargrove in his good suit had never thought to find out, was the full shape of Daniel Whitmore's life. They had seen an old man on 4 acres of unfashionable land, stubborn, alone, probably broke, certainly vulnerable. They had run the math and concluded that pressure plus time plus fear would equal signature. They had not run the full math. They had not accounted for the fact that Daniel had spent 22 years on the Callaway County Veterans Affairs Board, which meant he had spent 22 years doing favors for men and women across 4 counties. They had not accounted for the network of black landowners in the region, 16 families, most of them holding land that dated to the post-war South, all of them watching what happened to Daniel Whitmore with careful historical attention, because they knew, as their grandparents had known, that what starts with one family does not end there. They had not accounted for Marcus, who had spent 3 months documenting every harassing phone call, every fraudulent inspection, every manufactured code violation, every threatening letter, and had built a federal civil rights case that was now sitting in the office of a U.S. attorney in Atlanta who had been looking for exactly this kind of evidence against exactly this kind of developer for 2 years. They had not accounted for a journalist named Simone Park, who wrote for a national publication and had grown up in Callaway County, and had been watching the development pressure on black-owned land in the region for 4 years, and was waiting, simply waiting, for one case to crystallize into a story she could tell the entire country. They had not accounted for the fact that Daniel, 4 weeks before the fire, had quietly transferred the deed to a land trust, a legal structure Marcus had established, ironclad, specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of forced sale they were engineering. The land no longer belonged to Daniel Whitmore alone. It belonged to a trust with 7 trustees, including 3 attorneys, a judge, and a Baptist minister. You cannot intimidate a trust. You cannot threaten it or burn it or paint warnings on its sidewalk. The fire hadn't taken the land, it had only taken the house. And Daniel Whitmore could build another house. The story ran 6 weeks after the fire. Simone Park had worked fast and had worked carefully. The piece was 4,000 words and it named names: Preston Hargrove, Callaway Capital Partners, and the 3 county officials whose cooperation had allowed the campaign of harassment to proceed for the better part of 2 years. It detailed the pattern. 12 black-owned properties in the county had faced similar pressure in the past decade. 3 families had sold, 9 were still holding. It documented the suspicious fire with the fire marshal's contradictory report. It included the photographs Marcus had gathered and the legal filings, and near the end, 3 paragraphs about Daniel Whitmore that were read by 4 million people in the first 48 hours. He is 81 years old. He served in Vietnam. He buried his wife on that land. On the morning his house burned, he sat in a rocking chair and watched it go, and then he drove away and began making phone calls. He is not angry, he told me when we spoke in the pastor's garden behind Calvary Baptist Church where he has been staying. He is not angry because anger is for people who are surprised. They thought age was a weakness, he said, setting down his coffee cup on the garden table with a precision that felt like punctuation. They thought being old meant being alone, but I have been building things in this county for 50 years. What did they have? Money and a plan. I had everything else. The federal investigation was announced 11 days after the story ran. Preston Hargrove resigned from Callaway Capital Partners 3 days after that. 2 county officials went on administrative leave. The fire was reclassified as arson under investigation. Gerald Pitts, in a conversation that Daniel suspected cost him a great deal, called and admitted that he had been pressured by the county commissioner's office to list the cause as electrical. "I'm sorry, Daniel," Gerald said. "I should have." "You should have," Daniel agreed, "but you're telling me now that matters." The Callaway Capital development was suspended pending the federal inquiry. The 40 luxury townhomes, the boutique hotel, the curated retail experience, all of it frozen in whatever architectural drawings they had managed to produce, buildings that would never be built, at least not on that land. And on a Tuesday in April, 8 months after the fire, Daniel Whitmore broke ground on a new house. He didn't build it alone, he didn't have to. Marcus drove up from Atlanta with 2 of his cousins. The congregation of Calvary Baptist arrived in trucks with lumber and tools and casserole dishes. 3 of the 16 landowner families came with their grown children and their teenagers, who worked in the Georgia spring heat without complaint, handing up boards, running wire, learning something they would carry their whole lives about what it means to stand on ground that was paid for with everything. The foundation went in on a Tuesday. The frame went up on a Wednesday and Thursday. By Sunday, Daniel sat in his rocking chair, a Leaner's blue rocking chair which had survived because he had carried it out himself, because some things you hold on to, on the fresh wood of a new porch, and looked out at 4 acres of Georgia river bottom land, green and gold in the late afternoon light. The magnolia in the back corner just beginning to bloom. He thought about a Leaner. He thought about his father Roosevelt, who had handed him a deed and said, "This is your fight now." He thought about Tommy Reeves from Georgia, who had died so quickly that Daniel had barely had time to learn his last name. And he thought about what it means to survive not just the fire, not just the war, but the long accumulating weight of a world that keeps telling you to give up, to sell, to step aside, to accept less than what you built with your hands and your years and your love. 81 years of life gone in a fire. Not gone, transformed, clarified, made visible. Because that was the thing they had never understood, the fundamental miscalculation at the heart of everything they had done. They had thought that burning a man's house would burn his story. But a house is just wood and nails. The story is in the people who come to rebuild it. The story is in the great-granddaughter, 5 years old, who wandered over to the magnolia tree in the back corner and pressed her small palm against the bark and looked at her great-grandfather and asked whose tree it was. "It was your great-grandmother's," Daniel told her, "and now it's yours." She nodded very seriously, the way children do when they understand that something important has just been handed to them. He rocked in the blue chair. The magnolia bloomed. And Daniel Whitmore, who had survived a war and a grief and a fire and the long cruelty of men who mistook age for weakness, watched the sun go down over his land held in trust now, held for all the grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren who would stand on it long after he was gone, and felt something move through him that was not anger and not sorrow and not even triumph exactly. It was older than any of those things. It was the feeling of a man who planted a tree he would never see fully grown, and planted it anyway. It was the feeling of knowing that power, real power, the kind that lasts, was never in what you owned. It was in what you refused to surrender.